As we explore the polarities of democracy theory, the first element to note is that it is a critical theory. In the broadest sense, a critical theory provides a base or framework for research that focuses on decreasing oppression or domination of humanity and increasing liberty or justice in all forms. Polarities of democracy theory is based on the polarity thinking of Barry Johnson, which takes an unsolvable problem or tension and recognizes that it must be managed to maximize the best of each pole in opposition. Imagine inhaling and exhaling, whole and part, or individual and organization. One can't exist without the other. One thing to note is that each element of a pair has both positive and negative aspects. The goal then is to leverage the positive elements and minimize the negatives of each pole. We will look at this in a visual representation in a moment. The polarities of democracy theory encompasses 10 elements or 5 polarity pairs in a unified model. These elements were drawn from Dr. Benet's extensive review and coding of literature in his doctoral work and are intended as a guide for the planning, implementation, and evaluation of social change efforts in order to help build healthy, sustainable, and just communities. Let's take a look at those 10 elements in 5 pairs. There we go. All right, so the polarities of democracy model focuses on democratization of workplaces and society in the areas of freedom and authority, justice and due process, diversity and equality, human rights and communal obligations, and participation and representation. Each of these elements and pairs has equal importance within the polarities of democracy theory. And in each case, neither element of the pair functions well independently. Each element has positive and negatives, and the goal in using the theory in social change work is to leverage the positive elements of both poles in each pair. I'm going to ask Dr. Benet to take us through a graphic representation or map of the theory next. Pull that slide.
Thank you, Suzanne. So this is a graphic representation of the theory. It's the theory as a whole. I'm not going to try to go through every aspect of this map because it's pretty complex, but you would actually develop for the theory 5 of these maps: freedom and authority, justice and due process, etc. And the most important thing from Barry Johnson's polarity thinking and polarity management theory is that whenever you have a polarity with a pole on either side, there are 4 quadrants. And as you can see, the upper quadrants are where you want to be. Those are the quadrants that give you the positive aspects of each of the elements. And the lower elements, the lower quadrants, are where you want to avoid or where you want to minimize. Those are the negative aspects of each element. And of course, that also leads to the idea that each one of these 10 elements, when placed into their polarity relationship, has both positive and negative aspects. And so freedom on the left side would have positive aspects or negative aspects. You want to minimize the negative aspects. You want to maximize the positive aspects. And the more that you can do of that, in my theory, the greater democratization you have, whether in the workplace or in society. And you can, according to Barry Johnson, one of the problems you have is there tends to be this push and pull between the two sides, people championing for one element because they don't see the positive aspects of the other side and they don't see the negative aspects of their side. And so you can push back and forth, and the more you do that, the more you go into the negative aspects of both elements. So you really, now it's very complex understanding how you manage or leverage these elements to get the positive aspects, but certainly if people are more interested in that, there'll be lots of contact information at the end of the session. Suzanne, let me give it back to you.
Okay, I'm going to keep going unless I see anything in the chat. So we're going to move on to the next slide, which should bring us up to talking about from research to application. So first we'll talk about the scholar-practitioner aspect. I originally met Dr. Benet in my first doctoral residency. He was a presenter, and I signed up randomly, actually, for an individual advising session with him. I was briefly introduced to his theory, and he was introduced to my dissertation topic around proactive community-based philanthropy and systemic social change at the neighborhood level. Not long after that, I found myself in one of his courses, placing NGOs in a global context. In this elective class, I had the opportunity to explore a number of theories, including the Polarities of Democracy Theory, and Dr. Benet had probably what we consider to be ample opportunity to evaluate my writing and philosophical positions regarding social change. I was invited to join the Polarity of Democracy learning community that Dr. Benet maintains, and recognizing the potential for the theory in my dissertation work, I asked Dr. Benet to chair my dissertation committee when I completed my coursework. I began to explore how Dr. Benet's theory would serve as a framework in my dissertation while I was still completing coursework on the research sequence in the doctoral program, and was beginning to draft my dissertation prospectus. While all 5 polarity pairs in the theory form an integrated model, it is possible to focus on 1 or 2 pairs that may be most applicable to a certain topic or issue. My doctoral research is about community foundations or place-based philanthropy, and place-based philanthropy that is proactive rather than reactive in nature, and how this proactive philanthropic investment in policy concerns further, or hopefully less often, detracts from positive social change, especially in vulnerable neighborhoods. Because I'm looking at systemic social change, several of the polarity pairs of the theory are more applicable to my particular research on community level change than others. Funders, grantees, or residents' perceptions around economic and social quality of life indicators can benefit from using a lens of, for instance, diversity and equality, one of the 5 pairs, in analysis. For example, are longtime residents of lower economic status being pushed out by gentrification? Are people of color able to maintain their homes, remain in the neighborhood, or move into the community? Is there housing available for people of all income levels? Are the schools on par with those of other or more affluent communities? Depending on the answers, one could determine if both diversity and equality are being leveraged positively. Is the diversity in identity and the diversity of needs of the population celebrated and supported? And are there also equitable opportunities for everyone regardless of their situation or background? Both diversity and equality. One can also take that a step further. If you are looking to achieve a particular outcome such as school readiness for all children, understanding that you may need to leverage and support certain aspects of diversity by providing additional funding for at-risk children now in order to level the playing field to be able to leverage the equality pole for everyone to be treated the same as they progress through school and into the workforce later on. Another polarity pair from the theory that may be emphasized and used in analysis in my research around community-based philanthropic investment is participation and representation. This polarity pair does not only apply in the voting and governing sense of democracy, but also from a standpoint of what kind of engagement community members have in their community and what kind of community organizing exists to support both participation and representation. It can also be applied to what nonprofit and public organizations operate in the community and claim to represent it, or how residents have the opportunity to participate in the decision-making that those organizations have about the community, their missions, and how they in turn interact with the government and private funders on behalf of the community. We can talk further about how the theory can be applied to research or analysis in the Q&A segment, as I also want to touch on my other experiences working with Polarities of Democracy Theory in my professional capacity. So now we'll move on to that aspect. It again circles back to the learning community. Through the learning community, I became aware of other students and projects that were using the theory and Dr. Benet's goals to disseminate the theory for wider use. I approached him regarding my own professional background in fundraising and philanthropic work, and we began to look at options for expanding the reach of Polarities of Democracy through grant funding. At the same time, senior members of Barry Johnson's Polarity Partnerships firm were taking an interest in Polarities of Democracy, and together Dr. Benet and Cliff Kaiser and Barry Johnson, both of Polarity Partnerships, formed the Institute for the Polarities of Democracy, a new nonprofit organization. And I agreed to advise them in nonprofit management and fund development. At the same time, My own use of the Polarities of Democracy Theory continued in my dissertation, and then it began to expand into my consulting work with clients and philanthropic foundations, and now with even community-based economic and social justice organizations. As the Institute launched, I became more involved with its project management and administration, working closely with Dr. Benet and Cliff on evaluating mission, future goals, and funding opportunities. The Institute, through a grant from Polarity Partnerships, launched its first fellowship cohort, which included training and action plans that applied the theory and polarity thinking directly to organizations that the fellows were working with. I applied for a scholarship and was accepted into that group. More recently, and I will interrupt to say I think we have a couple of other fellows from that group in the chat room with us today. More recently, the Institute has developed its first book in a series on Polarity of Democracy Theory, an online training course that introduces you to the theory taught by Dr. Benet, which I participated in along with several Walden students, graduate, and faculty. In short, Polarity of Democracy has become a defining theory that I'm using across the board to further social change in my own research, scholarship, and professional life. And before we move on to the next section, I want to touch briefly on how the theory intersects or has applicability in social change across a broad spectrum of issues and different organizational or societal levels. Why is this theory applicable in both research and applied settings? Dr. Benet's theory grew out of his work with the nonprofit, political, and social change sectors. I believe he would tell you that he identified a commitment to democracy, but a lack around fully achieving functional democracy, and that his theory effectively addresses this. I would add that the integrated nature of the theory and the versatility supported by polarity thinking allows it to be used in small organizations and at a wider societal level. I will turn it back to Dr. Benet regarding that. He can disagree or not. And
thank you, Suzanne. We're going to have time for questions and answers with Dr. Schultz. But as you look at the 5 pairs, the 10 elements of the Polarities of Democracy, and I do argue that the full democratization requires you getting the positive aspects of all 10 of these elements, none of which are sufficient in and of themselves. And in addition, each pair is interrelated with the other pairs. So it's very complex, but it's important if we want to truly achieve democratization, and that becomes very important in our everyday lives. So just to give you a few things to think about current events and how the theory may be applicable, if you think about the Flint, Michigan water crisis, the diversity and equality pair, the freedom and authority pair, the participation and representation pair, think about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, human rights and communal obligations, the current asylum-seeking families down at our border, justice and due process, diversity and equality. In all of these different real-life, everyday situations, we see polarities present, and we see opportunities to either manage them more effectively to get more of the positives, or to do a very bad job and get more of the negatives. So I'll just ask you to be thinking about I would just very quickly, I have argued that democratization requires all 10 of these elements, requires the positive aspects of all 10. None of them are sufficient in and of themselves, and it gets a little tricky because each pair is interrelated with the others. But I just want to give you a couple of examples of things that you can be thinking about when we get to the Q&A with Dr. Schultz. In the real world, if you think about the Flint, Michigan water crisis, I would say we were dealing with diversity and equality and freedom and authority and participation and representation. Last year in Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, we were dealing with human rights and communal obligations. Right now, down on our border with the asylum-seeking families, we're seeing issues of justice and due process, diversity and equality, freedom and authority. So all of these real-life examples every day show us polarities of democracy that need to be leveraged effectively, or if we do a bad job, we get the negative aspects of those. So if you want to make a comment about any of them, you can put that into the chat box. But in just a couple minutes, we're going to get to the Q&A session with Dr. William Schultz from the Walden Center for Social Change, and we can address some of these real-life issues at that time, if you like. Well, while we're waiting for Suzanne to get back, there are a couple of references that are up on the screen that you can see. One is to the Managing the Polarities of Democracy article in the Journal of Social Change, and that can be found if you look in the web links down at the bottom of the screen. The first link is the Walden Library Collection. The Center for Social Change is creating collections of social change research completed at Walden and placing those collections in the Walden Library. The first collection is the Polarities of Democracy. My article is in there. There are 6 completed dissertations that are in there at this time. There's another 6 dissertations where our students have IRB approval and are finishing the studies. They're going to be in there in the next semester or 2. And we've got about another 20 students that are working in and have dissertations in the pipeline. Suzanne, are you back and you want to take over again?
So I'm sorry about that. So again, outside of Walden, we are still working on developing resources for the Institute for students, faculty, postdoc graduates on their practitioner social change projects. You can email either of us to learn about ongoing research, the resources we're developing, program work, fellowships, and future training opportunities. And I'm going to move us to the next slide. I say that, but... so that's our contact information, and you can reach out to either of us through our Walden emails, our professional websites. Before we hand things over to Dr. Schultz and I continue to work on my microphone, I want to thank everybody for participating today. I'm glad that my microphone didn't conk out until almost the end. Dr. Benet and I hope that you have gained an understanding of the role of theory from both academic research perspective and practitioner application in social change work. And I hope that you've learned the basics of Polarities of Democracy Theory to achieve positive social change and the potential for applying it at the research, project, community, or societal level. And I will make sure that we show you the references, and again, I would encourage you to check out Dr. Benet's article. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Schultz.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Bill. So Bill knows that I'm very interested in this. My own background before I went into strategic management was in political science. Mel and I were talking briefly as you guys were making the presentation, and Melanie said, "Wow, you could really use this in a multiple sets of contexts," and it kind of struck an insight that I'd never verbalized before. I built a course in systems thinking using effect, cause, effect kind of mapping, pretty traditional systems thinking based on Peter Senge's work. And it struck me that polarity thinking, which you referred to, and the entire logic of the polarities model is a form of systems thinking. If you go back to the slide with your 5 pairings, that would be useful. These are big buckets of constructs, but they do absorb and essentially guide. Nope, you had it. There you go. Guide human behavior in organizations, all organizations. So it's a really robust theory that way. If you're interested in sort of what can human beings do when we work together or not, explain, the theory can help explain failure as well. This really is an interesting systems theory, and I saw a number of questions from Joel and others about, well, how can I learn? Is there a playbook on how one can learn the the logic for thinking along the polarities thinking line, I would argue probably, Bill, there's an opportunity there for you guys to invite more people to the Institute and clearly to think about ways in which we can perhaps have some side conversations about how we can use this to inform some curricular work as well. Because what I see, and I know everybody on the phone is frustrated by this, we see a very dysfunctional, broken political system in the United States, and maybe even globally. And it struck me that, Bill, your paper addresses some of this, but it struck me that the theory itself is very powerful in perhaps deconstructing the various takes on democracy. So my question really, Bill, for you is as I see it, I'm kind of a Madisonian. James Madison liked checks and balances and really advocated for that. That our form of a Republican democracy, a democracy that infuses the 50 states as quasi-independent republics, as a way of building in checks and balances for experimenting in the various ways to implement these polarities. What's your take on that kind of an insight? And do we lose the very essence of who we are as a United States if we get too much control at the federal level, sort of extinguishing the ability to explore the polarities and their sort of robustness? I know it's a complicated question, but
it's a great question.
I wanted to throw it out there.
Let me start with Barry Johnson and his polarity thinking. And the key concept that Barry talks about is both and thinking. And so when you have freedom and authority, and you're getting the positive aspects of both and minimizing the negative aspects of both, that's the best of all worlds. And in that respect, you shouldn't be losing any of those traditional ideas that we have about the really robust and good things about American democracy. And certainly there have been some tremendously good things over a couple of hundred years. We've had some very nasty things as well, but we've had some very good things. And using polarities of democracy should only advance that by getting the positive aspects of both in all of these cases. Does that begin to answer that a little bit, Bill?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there was out of the business world, there was a very interesting book written by Jerry Porras, and I can't remember his other author, but it was called Built to Last. And in Built to Last, they make the same argument that if you think either or, you're pretty much done as an organization. It has to be the logic of and. And somehow our country has lost or is in the midst of a cycle where it's lost that ability to see and I'm not exactly sure why and what's going to break that cycle, whether it be some sort of external threat. But it's interesting. It does pose this framework poses a way to sort of systemically go back and look for ways in which one can see how the system broke and find ways to potentially improve it. So let's look at Joel's mentioned this a couple times. So let's look at Joel's question too. I think it's really interesting. As you noted probably 3 or 4 times, it's a complex theory, right? What's interesting about systems theory in general is the logic appears simple, but the execution is ridiculously difficult. If it wasn't, if complex systems weren't complex, we'd have the answers pretty quickly. So how do you, what is a little bit of knowledge about polarities of democracy dangerous? I mean, is it such that you have to get a little deeper before you can truly apply it well? I think Joel sort of wants a recipe book or a playbook that would help people put this into practice. I guess my question is, can you just dip a toe in the water, or do you have to kind of dive in all the way?
To dip your toe in the water, I don't think it necessarily would be too dangerous. But yes, if you really want to see how the theory plays out, you really have to dig into it with a little depth. Let me say this: it's certainly my hope that as we go forward, the expanding understanding and depth of commitment to this theory can be used to address very real problems that we're facing right now in America, but that we're facing all around the world. You see the rise of authoritarian governments in Europe and across the world. I think that the Polarities of Democracy can offer a way to move beyond that so that we're getting both and not either or. I do want to mention real quickly that on one hand, a lot of my thinking came out of democratic theory and governmental theory, but also it was rooted in systems theory with Blake and Mouton's managerial grid theory, Peter Senge that you mentioned of systems thinking. So you're absolutely correct when you identified that aspect of it in the theory. The other thing in terms of its broadening applicability, right now the 12 doctoral dissertations that are either completed or almost completed have all been in the School of Public Policy and Administration. But I'm talking with faculty members in other disciplines, particularly human services right now, about the possibility that this theory could be a very good theoretical framework for dissertations in that school, particularly because of its implications for positive social change.
I want to mention, I'll piggyback on what Bill just said, and I concur with all of that from a research and a broad applicability standpoint. But I do also think that I am finding when I'm using it in an applied setting with clients on the ground, or when I'm explaining it to somebody who thinks it might be a useful assessment tool, and that there's certain polarities that they want to jump in on, that they don't necessarily have to have the deepest understanding themselves in order for their organizations to benefit from the theory. I'm working with an organization now that has engagement issues in the community and is trying to figure out how best to engage with its stakeholders. And it is, of course, serving a vulnerable population, so it is trying to do it with honor. And I would say that while the maybe most senior staff has done a slightly deeper dive into understanding how the theory works and its tenets, a lot of the people who are working with us answering questionnaires using an assessment tool, they don't necessarily have to have the same level of understanding for it to be producing really good information and useful information that can provide results.
So that's very encouraging. Thanks for that context. Fantastic. Joanne asked a very interesting question too. Perhaps I can't read it all out. Can you see that, Bill?
About parallels to the polarities in the work on moral psychology, yes. Carol Gilligan was a large influence on my thinking when she talked about the lack of research in terms of how women view morality versus the traditional research that had been done on that had been focused mostly on the male perspective. And again, my research didn't study this, so I can't say it with authority, but the question in my mind as I looked at those moral psychology issues and differences from a male and a female perspective, it seemed to me that there might be a masculine and feminine perspective here, in which getting the best of both, consistent with Johnson's polarity thinking, would lead us to a better world. And as I developed these 10 elements and tried to identify both the positive and negative aspects of each of the 10 elements, that was very much in my mind. And certainly my suspicion is that these require that both and in the moral psychology and differences in values and perspectives as well. Probably a good area of research if anyone would like to do a dissertation on it.
Yes, indeed. So it's what I can tell you is that Walden is planning, if we can pull this off next year, to hold a couple of virtual virtual conferences, not necessarily social change conferences, but virtual conferences that will differ from what we're doing today in the sense that they will be targeted specifically at interdisciplinary teams looking at particular large-scale complex problems or issues. So, Bill, I'm going to make an invitation to you right now, and to Suzanne and others that are in your network to perhaps consider when the call goes out, participate in one of those upcoming conferences. There'll probably be 2 next year, maybe 3. And I very much would like to feature this polarities thinking. I think it's a real powerful theory. I think it's really interesting that Walden and our students and you under your leadership have really made this a sort of thought leadership approach, and we'll do what we can to try to support you getting it into more hands so it can be used in a more interdisciplinary fashion and get some more publications so people begin to really put it to the test.
I'd love to do that. Thank you, Bill.
Well,
I did want to say one other thing about the Institute for Polarities of Democracy, which has only been operating a year. It is a 501c3 organization, and we are in the very beginning of creating resources that would give people the tools to more effectively use the theory at both the organizational and community and societal levels. We have a virtual course in Polarities of Democracy that goes very deeply into all 5 of these areas, about 9 sessions of about an hour to 2 hours each. It is tuition-based through the Institute, but it is open to Walden students, faculty, and alumni without charge. So again, we're just in the beginning of creating those types of resources. But if people are interested, email me or go to the Institute website. We have a lot of things available already, and there'll be a lot more on the way.
Yeah, and I want to mention again that the Bill and Cliff are working on the first in a book series that will do a deeper dive into the theory itself and then each of the pairs. I know that some of you had questions further up in the chat that I can't still see about the pairs themselves. And behind the scenes, there's quite a lot that's been done through the Institute and the fellows that have been working with the Institute in the last year and a half on what we would call mapping or polarity mapping each of these pairs and questions associated with the positive and negative aspects in the 4 quadrants on that chart that we showed you before, which I'm trying to pull up. And there we go. So imagine each of these with only one pair and a chart that encompasses questions that would allow you to have conversations to even quantify perhaps people's perceptions around whether or not you are maximizing the positives of these various elements. And then to take it a step further and look at what are the action steps associated with the positive sides of these quadrants that we might want to look at. If I was working with a neighborhood-based client, we might be looking again, as I referenced before, at community engagement. And the action steps that we would associate with the positive, the top 2 quadrants, around, let's say, participation and representation would be things that could become a plan. And at the same time, we could identify warning signs for the lower two negative quadrants, that we want to minimize the time that we're spending down there in order to achieve the goals and to leverage that particular polarity. And there's a lot being done to make sure that really heavy lifting by Dr. Benet, other fellows. I think that a couple of folks, I think I saw in the chat room, Keith Nalagamo, sorry, Keith, for your last name, and Morris Giordano, who's also faculty at Walden. I think they're in the chat, and they participated in this mapping exercise as well. So the Institute is really making a concerted effort to develop tools that we will be able to use in order to further our consulting work, our research work, whatever avenue of social change that you are pursuing. We are trying to make sure that the tools will be available.
That's great. Thanks so much. I think we're running up against the end of our formal time now. So I really want to thank our presenters and the folks that have been able to participate and ask such great questions and listen to what I think is a really compelling way to analyze the world around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
We'll stick around in the chat for just a couple of minutes if anybody else has any questions. And again, I'll encourage you to reach out to us, and we are happy to connect you to more information about the theory. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Shauna, as well. We really appreciate everybody attending, and as I said, we are happy to take any further questions and look forward to talking to all of you. Thanks so much.